Welcome to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. And if you've been following the past few episodes here, you've noticed that I've kind of made it a focus here to get some more women voices on the podcast. And today is another chapter of that journey. And I am super thrilled to bring on Carling Jackson. You may know her from Instagram as the athlete artist. So, Carling, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar, Carling does a lot of this awesome athlete portrait work and a lot of just really impressive art. And when I made a post on Threads looking for a guest and she responded, I was actually shocked. So I kind of want to get into Carling's journey and a little bit about her art. So if you don't know, she played soccer for many years. So I guess what drew you into that sport? Obviously, if I'm correct, if I'm wrong, but you are Canadian, and so when a lot of us silly Americans here in Canada, we think of hockey. So what drove you to soccer?
Really, as a 4-year-old, my parents kind of put me in everything. It was they wanted to have me and my brother. He played basketball. He's 6'8". Kind of like watch whatever sport we were most drawn to, and my mom was like, I knew, she's just like, I had a feeling it was soccer, even though at 4 years old you don't even know which goal to score on, right? You're just kind of like sitting there, right? So it wasn't until I was about 9 that I really fell in love with the game, and I decided to take it quite seriously. So I ended up in like private training programs at 12, kind of like similar to what you'd see in Europe. We had like one in Canada. And then Canada Soccer made the first ever soccer school. So it was in Burnaby, which was about an hour and a half by like bus and train. So I ended up transferring to that high school and did the soccer program. So half my day was soccer and the other half was art. So I was
So it
in
worked out.
heaven. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, were there any, as you were growing up and getting more dedicated, were there any specific athletes that you saw that really kind of inspired your play style in soccer, or was it just kind of finding your own thing?
Actually, I was really drawn to team like the Brazilian players. So Ronaldinho was my kind of idol as a little kid. Just the way Brazilians play at that time too. It was like, 2002, they won the World Cup, so they were at the height of, world football. And so I really looked to their style of play. And I had 2 Jamaican coaches, one who used to coach the Jamaican national team when I was about 10. And so they really taught me how to use all parts of your foot when you're dribbling, and really, like, I would say much more Latin America style of play than traditional North American style. So I combined those 2 styles, which was really beneficial in getting a scholarship. And yeah, so.
I lived in the Middle East in the early 2000s,
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, so I lived in Jordan, and so at that time, when we moved, it is in 2002, and you saw a lot of people. They were just obsessed with that Brazilian style, the Ronaldo and Ronaldinho, Roberto Carlos jerseys. They were just
Gilberto
all
Silva.
yeah, everybody. They were just like that was like the item. So you go around, you see yellow everywhere, right? And so it's funny you say that because like Ronaldinho was just like. The only thing I could equate it to is like the way that like Americans look at LeBron James. It was just
Yeah.
that was the way he was revered. Obviously, just like the artistry of his style, which is
Yeah.
always I feel like a trademark you see in Brazilian footballers, right?
Yeah,
And
totally.
yeah, so that's a great place to start. I think if you're looking to be inspired by somebody. On a more somber note, you dealt with some injuries that kind of prematurely ended your career. I guess
Yeah.
what was that like just going through that? And you worked so hard on this. You mentioned it was like your days were soccer and art, and so one half of that now all of a sudden is kind of taken away. Um, what was that process for you like to kind of accept that this really wasn't going to happen the way you might have envisioned?
Honestly, like you'll see a lot of athletes actually Thierry Henry talks about this,
Mhm.
and he asked what it was like to retire and lose the game. And his description like hit me right here because he talks about it being like a death you have to get over because it's like a part of you dies. And I don't think people who don't play sports like really can really quite understand because you have a very limited timeline of your life to play right before
Right.
you get injured or you get too old or you age out. And so you fall in love with this game, and you unlike other professions, right, you dedicate your body So it's like
Yeah.
your body, your mind. In other professions, you're not getting up at 4 a.m. and doing an hour of fitness sprints. That's just not what you're doing. You're not sacrificing your body on the field, risking injury. And you're not really, where the work ethic is also different, I find. And so it was like losing a part of me. I had to mourn the death. And I realized how I cope with things is I disassociate. So instead of like retiring and like becoming a coach, ready going to get my license, I just couldn't play. And people are like, why don't you play recreationally when you're better? I'm like, if I'm not able to be the best, I don't want to do it. Right. It was just kind of like, so I tore my ACL a month after I signed my scholarship, which was just a nightmare.
Wow.
And I have a work ethic that is, like my friends say, we don't understand you. So I rehabbed an ACL in 4 months, which
Oh
I
wow.
learned, yeah, which I learned was not good because it didn't give the ligament enough time to recover. So I actually lost
Yeah.
my speed, and I was one of the fastest players in Canada. So as a center back, like having that kind of speed is imperative. Like I would kind of jokingly, like when the ball was played in the corner, it was a foot race. I would slow up and wait for the other girl to be on one foot, and I'd hit her. Like just she'd flip. Like I had, and I felt, this domination I had. If you're in my 18-yard box, you're fair game. Don't come in
Yeah.
my box then. You know what I mean? And so I remember this one time, it was when I was an art assistant and I had just retired. I ended up injuring my back as well, which I had surgery for just last year. And I gotten into an altercation with this kind of horrible boss, and I remember envisioning, like, I wish that we were on a field right now and you were fair game. Like I miss soccer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the commitment aspect is something that I think a lot of people don't really think about that much. You always see the online criticism of like when they're critiquing a player, like, oh, you should calm down because you're playing a kid's game or whatever. It's like, it's not like you're going onto the pitch and you're just, all right, let me go in cold. Like there's a lot more dedication behind it that I think a lot of people overlook. And yeah, just like that being gone, like you said, it's like it's a mourning of death, which is I think probably the best way to put it. So shout out to Thierry for that.
Yeah.
Um,
He was like
uh,
almost crying when he was saying it. And I was like, that's exactly what it's like. Also, my friend Arian Foster, who's like a renowned NFL player for the Texans, we were talking about this. He's a musician as well. And he wrote the most amazing song on what it's like to lose football, and I can't wait for him to release it. So I've had this conversation kind of recently too. So yeah.
Yeah, and you think about like, especially with footballers, it's like you get into these academies at a very young age, and if
Yeah.
you're, an elite talent, and that's your life, at a young age, and then to just have it taken away, or if when it comes to retirement, I would imagine that's incredibly hard as well, just because like this is all you've known,
Yeah.
and you're in your mid-30s, and now what do I do, and it just, but kind of get into what you did do is you did
Yeah.
get into art, so.
Yeah.
Obviously, you were focused on art before that, but what kind of drew you to really just dive fully into that? Some people could say like, "Hey, you could have just thought of a whole new lane to be a part of that disassociation that you mentioned." So, why did you
Yeah.
decide to go all in on art at that moment?
So I have 11 years of university, and none of it is in art. So
Wow.
yeah, I have a Black History degree from Southern University A&M, so I'm an HBCU grad, and then I have an education degree from UBC, which specializes in social justice, international baccalaureate program, arts, and social studies. And then I also did about 2 years of sports psychology, and indigenous culture, history, art for social change at a different university. So I have like a very unique education background. And so around 2013, 2014, I was kind of in this program looking at how we can use different forms of art to raise awareness about injustice against Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we worked with residential school survivors. And at that time, my mom like somehow got me a job teaching at a private school, like art. And I fell in love head over heels with teaching. I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And I was looking at UBC, University of British Columbia's teaching program. At the time, it was ranked top 10. And I was like, okay. And right around then, it was 2014, I got an opportunity to go to Brazil to the Street Child World Cup. It's put on ahead of every men's World Cup in the same city to give street children a platform to speak about the injustices they face in their countries, because many of them don't have rights. Like Pakistan was one, for example, South Africa, Brazil. And so A month before the tournament, the captain of Team Brazil was murdered on his 14th birthday when he went home to see his mom. And he was my first oil painting. And something came over me. It was really, I don't know how to explain. I'm a spiritual person, but all my religious friends were like, that was Allah, that was God, that was, and so it was just like the voice that kept saying, paint him, paint him, paint him, paint him. And so stupidly, 2 days before I leave for an international flight, I go purchase a huge piece of wood because I didn't know about wood canvas at the time. And I paint Rodrigo, and it's oil paint, so it does not dry in 2 days.
Yeah.
Tell me why I walked into the Vancouver airport with a wet oil painting, not packaged, that would not fit in luggage. Like, so I go to the U.S. Customs. The guy looks at me like, you're joking, right? I took like 10 million flights, poor students. So it was like 4 flights to get to Brazil.
Yeah.
And they just look at me like, no way. And then I turn it around and I tell the story. The guy ended up being from South America, and he was like this, like, shh.
Oh, yeah.
And then I get to the flight. The pilot's like, where are we going to store this painting? And I told him the story. He starts like tearing up. He moves his own luggage to store the painting. And it was just this repeated kind of thing. And I was like, there's something here. Like, people are getting emotional. People are changing, right? And so I get to Brazil, and they don't know that I painted Rodrigo. It was like spur of the moment. So they ended up putting in the chapel, non-denominational chapel. And the night Team Brazil gets there, they had just buried Rodrigo. And they all grew up in a shelter together called O Pequeno Nazareno in Fortaleza. And so this is their brother. This is their family, right? And they arrive, and it's pitch black out. I don't know how this happened, but someone else told me they watched Team Brazil walk by the chapel. Someone saw Rodrigo's face to the tiny slit and ran in. And they all ran in. I don't know they're in there. And the site is huge. There's like enough housing for 600 people, 6 soccer fields. I happen to walk by as they're coming out, and I just pause, and they're all crying. And I was like, shoot, I don't speak Portuguese. So I was just like this, like gestured a painting. And that was the moment my whole life changed. I became Brazilian in that moment. They welcomed me as part of their family. They brought the painting to lunch, breakfast, dinner. I got interviewed by media from all over the world. Like, why would you paint a kid you didn't know? I hated that question. And it just, in that moment, I was like, I'm going to be an artist. Like, there's whatever trajectory I was on, it was just like, skirt. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. So it was Rodrigo who inspired me. And I promised the kids I worked with and his brothers, and they told me stories. We had translators about Rodrigo. And I made a promise to myself and to like the spirit of Rodrigo that I would help marginalized children around the world in the same way. And I would dedicate my art to the most marginalized kids in conflict zones, refugees, etc. And so I went home. I'm like, okay, no one wants to buy sad paintings. So what do I know? I know sport. I know athletes. I majored in Black history. There's predominantly Black leagues, in the United States. So we have the same heroes. I painted lots of Jackie Robinson, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, etc. Right? And so I was like, okay, who's doing this right now? It was like kind of all older white men who never played sports. So I was like, okay, there's no woman. I'm gonna carve this path. I'm gonna pave this lane, or try to. And so I started painting for pro athletes. First the Toronto Raptors, a few players, and then Jay Crowder in the NBA, Amir Johnson, and then word got out in the NFL. And then I really wanted to get to the Premier League, so I painted Jonathan Mensah in the MLS, Ghana Black Stars, and then people saw that, were like, "Whoa, this is so cool!" And then I got to the Premier League, Champions League. Now I've painted for 260 athletes across 16 sports, 24 countries, and 19 leagues. And so, and I gave myself 5 years to get establish myself enough and get a bit of a following to then go back to human rights artwork. So my first project was with Afghanistan refugee children, with War Child. And so I try and do projects every year. So I'm a human rights artist and a sports artist. And so I've worked with War Child, Save the Children, World Vision, Indigenous people in Canada, because there's a lot of oppression and injustice against Indigenous people still here. So I try and I've done some quite big projects with them. And I love when there's a crossover too. Like I painted Terry Felix recently, who was the first Indigenous professional player in all of North America. So he broke the color line for soccer in North America, and Canada has never honored him. So yeah, so I painted that, and I was asked by Musqueam First Nation, and Terry and the family and an artist I know. And that's like a huge honor being non-Indigenous, you know, that's like unheard of. So that's going up in BC Place, which is a World Cup stadium for 26. And yeah, that's kind of this how I dove into art.
You know, the genesis of it is just like it's like destiny, right? You mentioned,
Yeah.
like, religious people will probably say God did this or whatever, but yeah, it just feels like you had this moment and then you're inspired to do something, and then the ripple effect of that just became, like, oh, this is a sign, and then you you approach it like an athlete would, right?
Yeah,
Which is,
exactly.
yeah, which is just like, okay, this happened. What is the end goal? Let me set a timeline and I'm going to go ahead and attack this, which
Yeah.
I think is such a unique aspect of what you do, because a lot of people just have like preconceived notions of like the tortured artist or
Yeah.
whatever, and you're just like, no, I'm going to be goal centered and go ahead and try to do this. I guess speaking on your, because I want to get to your all the social justice causes in a second here, but kind of going into your approach when you're doing all these commissioned works for athletes, do you think that the fact that you were an athlete, or how does the fact that you were an athlete really dictate for you to kind of drive home the emotion? Because you could feel it, right? Like I've seen some of your portfolio, and you feel the emotion and the rawness of it through your work. So can you talk to me a little bit about that whole process?
Yeah. So I call them portraits of immortality. So the goal there, like I have sometimes you get the athlete who's like, I know what I want. It's this moment,
Mhm.
this catch, this goal, and sometimes you get, an athlete like Tyron Woodley, UFC, 20 years. He's like, Car, I gotta help me pick one image from my career. This happens actually more often than you think, where it's like I help, search and guide them, and sometimes they're just like, I just don't know. So I run them through kind of a visualization, like what they would experience on the field. And I'm like, okay, think about like the one moment where you felt the most powerful, almost invincible on the field, where you felt the passion and the love and the desire and the power, where you just felt invincible. Remember that moment on the field, and then they'll pause, right? And I'm like, okay, do you have one of those moments? And they're like, yeah. Like, what do you want to see on your wall when you're 60? And the goal is to help them kind of relive that moment that was so powerful and so meaningful, like Emile Smith's first goal for Arsenal I painted, or Sha'Carri Richardson, beating her 100-meter record and becoming the fastest woman in the world. Like there's all these incredible moments, and I try and put myself as an athlete. I think it's integral to my experience because I know how to help them find the moment, because I've been an athlete, I've been a
Yeah.
gladiator, and I know how to bring that to life because I've had those same emotions. And I think that's what separates me from a lot of other sports artists who paint sport, is I was a Division I athlete and I love my game more than life. And I think, most of the athletes I work with are similar. So I think it's integral.
Yeah, that approach is so fascinating to me, because it's just like, it's not like, oh, well, let's just find your biggest highlight and paint it, and it's just more so, hey, what would, it could have been just a, like, if to use like an American football thing, if you're like a big play you made, or just that really you felt something and there was some emotion there, and I feel like when you have the core of that, then
Mhm.
you being able to express that as an artist, it just kind of comes, right? Or am I
Yeah.
maybe off base on that?
No, no, totally, totally. I really I love, like, let me tell you something. I am so honored that athletes come to me,
Yeah.
right? Of all, like, they have more money and access. They could go to anyone in the world. They could, right? I mean, the average salary of most of my clients is like 5, 6 million a year, right? Up
Mhm.
to, I don't know, some of them make stupid money.
Yeah.
And so they come to me, and it's the most humbled, honored feeling. So I take that really seriously. Also, like, who gets to paint like a moment for I'm painting one of the Eagles right now, the moment he won the Super Bowl and he's crying on the field with his son. The NFL posted it.
Mhm.
Mekki. I
Yeah.
don't know if
Yeah.
you saw it. Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
So bringing that to life, like, I take it so seriously, and so I have so much passion for that. Like, I'm painting sports history for the actual athlete. That's crazy, right? Like, no one is doing that. So I take it so seriously, and I'm so honored that athletes choose me to do that for them. So
I mean, you could just hear the passion in your voice, right? Like when somebody cares, like you could tell that they care, you know?
Yeah.
And it's just which is huge, which I would imagine that is another reason why your client list continues to grow.
Yeah.
Uh, on your website, you mentioned that you're a self-taught artist, which
Yeah.
again it makes the whole story that you have here that much more impressive. So, like, talk me through that. Like, when you were learning, was it just like a whole lot of trial and error? Like, how did you go about you really honing in and refining your craft?
Yeah, I actually saw a quote from Picasso recently. There's only a few self-taught artists in history. I low-key thought like there were a lot more than I looked it up. I'm like, oh my God, there's like a handful. And he talks about just like, so for me, I incorporate visualization, which I learned as an athlete. And I didn't realize I was doing this till someone asked me this question. And I was like, oh my God, because it's kind of unconscious. And so when I see a picture, I do paint it in my head like you would prepare for a game on a field.
Yeah.
So I go through all the steps of painting, get the colors, the blending. I do it all, but it's like in like a minute. Like, oh, I'm like, okay, done. And then when I actually paint it for real, I've already done it. So it's like I use the exact same tactics as an athlete, but apply it to art. And I also, this is going to sound crazy, but it's true. I started going to the Louvre in France twice a year. Um, and I learned by copying the master's paintings. So I would sneak in pastels, oil pastels, and I would sit there in front of the most iconic paintings in history, and I would copy them. And I still do that like twice a year. It's the most magical experience. It's like time travel. You get to step into the artist's shoes in a way. And so that was my teaching.
I'll tell you right now that that's not crazy, and I'll tell you why. So, for my day job, I do super boring, but I do like learning content for business sales in the computer space, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times it incorporates like graphic design elements, and as I'm watching, still consuming content online, on websites, seeing things on TV, I'll see something and it's just like, oh, I could incorporate something like that, put my own twist on it. So to me, inspiration comes wherever it comes from, right?
Mhm.
And it could be watching something, it could be something in the back of your mind, it could be traveling to the Louvre every couple of months to see all the great work. But I mean, that's a great excuse to go to France too. So
Oh
I
yeah, and it's a tax
got the
write-off.
problem with that. Perfect.
Yeah.
So that's like just a great thing to do. And so yeah, so definitely not weird. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the social justice campaigns that you've been a part of here. Obviously, you graduated from HBCU, which of course exposed you to a lot of injustices. So can you tell me a little bit about how you really developed a keen interest in trying to make a difference?
Yeah, so I was 17. So initially I was at Louisiana Lafayette and I transferred to Southern.
Yeah.
So Louisiana Lafayette is a PWI, predominantly white institution. And so
Mm.
I didn't realize the social structure that I was in there was social segregation still in Lafayette. There were segregated proms for high schools, which is just
Wow.
crazy. Um, and even the cafeteria, the only table that was kind of mixed was the athletes table. And so I'll never forget this, my first day of school, I was on crutches. I'd flown down after having surgery, and I'm crutching very slowly to class. And this black football player named Booker Jenkins comes up. Never met him before. And he's like, "Can I walk you to class?" And I'm like, "Okay." And I was very shy then, like not as outspoken as I am now.
Mhm.
And I'm like, "Okay." He's like, "I need to teach you something." In my head, I'm like, "That's a weird thing to say to a stranger, but okay, you know." And so I'm crutching. And he's like, "I want you to watch how people look at us on either side of the street. Me, a black man, you, a white woman." And so crutching along, and I'm like looking, and I'm like, "Oh wow!" One side of the street was like mostly white, one side was mostly black, and the white people look angry, and the black people look curious. And we keep going, keep going. He turns to me, he said, "You learned something?" And that it's like my vision went from like color to black and white. And it's
Mhm.
like you're not in Canada anymore, right?
Yeah.
And then I had another instance where Tyron Johnson, he's a basketball player. He came up to me one time and said, "Excuse me, miss." And he has his head down. He's like, I'd like to talk to you for a second, but I've never spoken to a white woman before." And I'm like, "What do you mean you never spoke to a white woman?" And he's like, "I went to a all black neighborhood, elementary school, high school, right?" He's like, "You just seem approachable." And we became friends. And he told me his great grandmother worked on a plantation.
Jeez.
So I'm hearing all this. And, I ended up finding out, unfortunately, my team was mostly racist, and we were the only team with all white people. And my coach that recruited me was fired. We had this horrible coach. He was misogynistic, racist, sociopathic, horrible. And he told me to stop hanging out with black people, because in the first week of school, I like hung out with my team and they were using, racist terms. And I'm like, not hanging out with you anymore. And I was like, okay, I'm going to choose black Americans. And apparently I made the wrong choice, according to all the white people and my team and my coach. But I wasn't going to switch. So I ended up taking an American history course. I stupidly majored in fashion design. They wouldn't let me major in art because it conflicted with practice time, and I cannot sew to save my life. So, but it's America. So regardless of your major, you take American history. And I'm in class and I'm like, this doesn't feel as though it's the truth, right? Because I just heard from you guys ended slavery in 1865 and there was no slave. But why did my friend's great grandmother work on a plantation? There's a lot of things
Doesn't
that
add up. Yeah.
doesn't add up. And I love learning and education. I have an education degree. I come from a family of educators, and so I felt betrayed by the system because I trusted it. So it was this betrayal to me. I was very upset. So I was like, I want to learn the truth. So I didn't ask anyone. I like went and did it myself. I was like, okay, I'm going to take a Black history course. And it was two completely different narratives. And there's a famous quote by Rumi, who's a very incredible poet from I think the 14th century. And he said, you know the truth by the way that it feels. And I fell head over heels in love with Black history because I was like, this is incredible. And feels like the truth. Truth is so powerful, right? You can feel it. And so I ended up switching my major to Black history, or to history with a specialty in Black history. I didn't take any European courses. I took African history, Egyptian history, Brazilian history, everything. And so then what happened after that, when I switched my major, was in that for a year. I got called by the NAACP and recruited by them. And this is the crazy story. I was 18 now, and there was a parish called Kaplan Parish, and they were going to have their first ever Black History Month celebration. They'd never celebrated. Predominantly white town, a lot of racism. And apparently there was threats of a race riot at the school if they went ahead with this. And so they called the NAACP. The NAACP called someone at my school, Dr. Danny Cottenham, who I knew. And he's like, so I have this unique, she could be seen as neutral because they needed a neutral speaker. Oh, yeah. So he's like, she's majoring in Black history, but she's a white Canadian. And I feel like she might be able to get both groups in the room, because that was the issue. They want, Yeah. And so my first time public speaking, I went to Kaplan Parish with the NAACP and gave a speech on Black history in front of like 600 people to help calm a racial uprising, or riot. And so that was my introduction into combating racial injustice. So
when you experience it for the first time, it's incredibly jarring. So yes. I grew up in New York City, and so in New York, it's a melting pot, right? There's everybody, and so, and I moved to Detroit after I graduated high school, and you see they kind of called it this dividing line, and where south of this one road, it was where all the Black people tended to live, and north of it is where all the white people would do it. And, it was a dynamic after the race riots in 1967. They called white flight, and so you start, and of course I'm like, well, no one really taught me this in history classes, right? To your point, and you start looking into it, and you're just like, wow, this fucking sucks, and in the years since, I've kind of been like you, just always wanting to learn more. So whether it's reading books or listening to like history podcasts that you feel are reputable, and that's always been an interest of mine as well. And I always say history books are often written by the victors, and
I hate history textbooks.
So like they're written by the people who can shape who oppress, who could shape the talking points the way they want to shape them. So that's kind of the foundation of what got you kind of really interested in that. Now, obviously, you've transitioned that into your art pieces as well. So, what is the difference, I guess? Obviously, you have these athlete paintings, and now you have stuff that's geared more towards social injustice and all that. So what's the difference in your approach for those two?
So I practice what's called art for social change. It's a very unique philosophy where you use the goal of the artwork comes out of the respectful dialogue between groups. So you might have artists you're working with or non-artists, and who might approach you or you might approach them. So you work with an individual or an organization, foundation, or group of people who are experiencing injustice in some way or oppression. And we come together and collaborate and think of ideas to honor their experience, to raise awareness, to raise money, whatever the end goal might be. And it's so interesting because I always go into it with like kind of an idea, and only a few times, like one time I literally had a vision of the piece and then it ended up being exactly my vision. Very weird, eerie. And so yeah, and as a artist you kind of remove yourself, right? And you become the canvas, and it allows for them to come in. And I'll give you an example of this. When I did my teaching degree, I was teaching at a high school that was super diverse, and Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, had just announced 25,000 refugees from Syria were going to be coming into British Columbia. This resulted in a lot of Islamophobia, as you can imagine, xenophobia, racism. And so my school, during my teaching practicum, which was only 2 months, I decided I was going to create curriculum on the Syrian Civil War, combine 2 classes, and do a whole campaign. And my university was like, absolutely not. You're a student teacher. You're crazy. And then they're like, if your principal says yes, you can do it. My principal said yes. And my school was like totally freaked out. And so I had a social justice 12 class, an IB art 11 class, combined them. And we did an entire campaign called Students for Syrian Refugees. And I had become friends with a refugee from Saudi Arabia who was trying to help Syrian refugees. And he's like, I have this family who'd be interested, because we needed to work with, so all my students had just learned about the war, and now they have a refugee family in the room. And they're just like, because my goal was to make what they learn in the classroom real, make their impact real, give them a chance to rise and affect global change. That's what I wanted to do, because I believe in students' capacity to do that if you give them the tools, right? And so this family came in. We had a translator who was a girl from another class, not one of my students. She just heard about this project and volunteered, right? That kept happening. And the family communicated to us. They said, we are so excited to join you on this project, because we've been wanting to do something like this, but we don't have the artistic tools. So there's a perfect example. You have an extremely marginalized group. You have a group of students with photography skills and painting skills to bring something incredible to life. And we took photos, and then they were cropped as just their eyes, and we let them decide, like, how much of your face do you want to show. They said just the eyes. They signed a contract honoring their commitment to this, and honoring like their, they just wanted their eyes cropped and shown. And we had a company volunteer, like at no cost, to print them, like 7 feet long and 3 feet high, and we posted them on the outside of school. And the students called it, we are like students for Syrian refugees, we are people too, because of the dehumanization. And then they all painted, and we had a whole art show. We auctioned the pieces off to raise money. And then my family, this is really cool. We had like my parents, it was Thanksgiving, and they made a halal dinner. My mom did, for the family that worked with us. And I got all the kids art supplies. There was just one moment where my students were taking photos of them, and they had a little 2-year-old, and like they had just fled war, right? I can't imagine what they'd seen. And the little 2-year-old looked bored, like the adults are talking, and I understand kids pretty well. I'm kind of a big kid. So I go and get pastels and paper, and I just place them beside him, and I just point and I say, all go ahead. He went crazy, coloring, going nuts, running around like he did 20 masterpieces in like an hour. And then it was his time to be photographed, and they tried to take the art supplies from me. He started crying. And it was like just a beautiful moment. When we left, his dad said, maybe my son could be an artist in Canada now too. And I started to cry. I'm like, oh my God. So as a thank you, I bought all the kids, like their 2 kids, all this art supplies. And so that was my first kind of big art for social change project in Canada. It was really successful. So
you talked about the dehumanizing element, and for me, so I'm half Palestinian, and
oh wow.
So I've visited Palestine before. I lived in Jordan for multiple years, and when you come back to America and you talk to people about it, they see it differently, right? And when you expose them to something that, to your point, humanizes people, it really can make a difference. So that was a beautiful story. I appreciate you sharing that. Just as an Arab man myself, it's because far too often we get labeled and looked at a certain way, and the term terrorism gets thrown out way too loosely, and for your example, like you're talking about, refugees of war, and that shouldn't be be labeled that way, and that should be looked at in a human with a human lens. So that's just awesome stuff. I
Thanks.
do want to, of course, thank you for sharing. So I do want to close out here on just we talked a lot here about your process and the work you've done and all that. So when people see a piece by you, what are you hoping that they're seeing? Like, what is the messaging that you're really trying to convey? Obviously, every piece is different, but just like when they see something that you've done, what do you hope that the viewer sees?
But for sports art, I hope I've actually, it's interesting you asked that. I've been told that when people see my art in person, they have a whole experience. Like, and versus when they just see it online, they're like, "Oh, that's amazing." But like, it's almost like I try and capture the spirit of the person, right? One of my clients called me a biographer, a paint of people. So it's like, can a painting be a biography? Can it tell a whole story in a face and a movement and a gesture? And so I try as hard as I can to capture the spirit. So when you look at it, you feel the spirit of the person. That's my goal. And so, yeah.
That's a fantastic way to put it, honestly. Just to be able to for somebody to describe it that way, I think
Yeah.
is so telling of the work that goes into it, right? That
Thanks.
you're putting in all this stuff and that you're able to tell a story. Because some people say, oh, painting's a painting, whatever, but you start seeing little details that speak more to what it is. So
Mhm.
so that's a really interesting and fascinating way to explain that. I really like that.
Yeah.
Carling, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this episode. This was just a really, really cool conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having
Can
me.
you, yeah, of course. Can you just let everybody know where they could follow you and all your work?
Yeah, it's Carling Jackson, and Carling is spelled like darling with a C. And my Instagram is Carling Jackson Art. So
Awesome. Yeah. So make sure to give Carling a follow. We will have all those links to her stuff in the show notes. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and we will see you later.